As you've probably gotten accustomed to over the last week and a half, if you're not commenting, it's probably best to be on mute, just so we don't have the feedback and that kind of thing that occurs. Although we're a pretty small group, so there shouldn't be too terrible much trouble with that. This opportunity grew out of discussions I had earlier this semester with a number of faculty who had applied for faculty development leaves for last year, but were declined through the review process to get the leave that they had requested. And of course, this happens every year. And through the conversations this year, hearing the same sorts of things, having the same sort of discussion we have each year with those that didn't get that opportunity after applying for it. I talked to Suzanne briefly, and it just struck us it might be a good idea to have a couple of people who have been very recently active on the review committee, along with a couple of people who in the last 2 or 3 years have been on a leave, just talk about the faculty development leave experience from those perspectives. One perspective being, here's kind of what we look for in applications, what stands out, what kind of raises questions about an application. And then those that have been on leaves, how did you come up with your idea? How did you formulate that idea and present that idea in a way that apparently others were able to read it and know what you wanted to do and found it worthwhile and put you on your way to a leave? And some of you might be able to talk from both those perspectives, because being a member of the faculty development leave, we often obviously look for people who've been on a leave and can speak to that experience from both sides then. And that's what we'd like to do. So I know some of you are interested in this from the standpoint of thinking about your own leave opportunities, or coaching others perhaps in their applications and encouraging them to take that opportunity. So I know you'll have some interest in probably some good questions and comments along the way. What I think we might like to do is I will just have each of the panelists introduce themselves and their experience with either the review committee or a recent leave or both, and then let them comment just kind of generally about the process, their experience with it, in about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for some questions from our guests that are here to engage in this discussion with our faculty development leave participants. And I'm looking at the panelist or participant list on the screen here, so I might just introduce our panelists in the order I'm seeing you here. And that starts with Seiichi. Not missing somebody. I think the rest are participants. So we might start with Seiichi, and then after Seiichi is Wyatt, and then Jorge Ramirez, and then Emily Skidmore is there as well. So in that order, if you would, and I'll remind you if you forget. So Dr. Nagihara.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. My name is Seiichi Nagihara. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Geosciences. So I have been on the leave twice so far. I think the first one was around 2011, and the second one was just last fall semester. So I have I've never been on the committee. So I don't know, shall I just talk about my experience, or go ahead? So do you want to let other people get introduced first? I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, why don't we have the quick introductions, and then we can come back to you and
Okay.
hear about your experience and so forth. So Wyatt, you would be next.
Okay, great. So I'm Wyatt Phillips. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and I'm currently 2 years into a 3-year term on the faculty development leave selection committee. So that's sort of why I'm here.
Jorge?
I was trying to unmute my microphone. So yes, Jorge Ramirez, I am a professor at the law school. I applied for development leave in the fall of, I made the actual application in the fall of 2014 for a development leave for a full year from the fall of 2015 through the spring, so fall of 2015 and spring of 2016. I had never taken a development leave. I had worked here for 15 years, and it was great. I loved it. And I have served on the committee for 3 years. I'm just finally, thankfully, cycling off of the 3-year commitment on that committee, which is a lot of work, but it's really it's quite educational because I find out a lot about what our colleagues are doing all across the campus, and I definitely have some ideas that I'd like to share with you about things that I thought were great to be included, things that weren't so great, and other sort of tips. But I'll let Emily introduce herself.
Right. Hi, I'm Emily Skidmore. I'm an associate professor in the history department. I have recently applied for leave, and I actually will be on leave in the fall, the upcoming semester. So I am excited about how I developed my proposal, and I'm so grateful that it was approved, and look forward to my leave in the fall.
Great, thank you. Did I miss anybody that's on the panel? I think I got, not sure my screen covers everybody that's in here. So let's go. Okay, let's go back to Seiichi and just talk a little bit about your experience and any recommendations you would have to folks that are contemplating a leave.
I don't know if my experience may be a good example. I guess the first thing, it maybe kind of also depends on which area you're working in. Like in my case, I'm in natural science, geosciences. So that's why my experience may not directly apply to people in like liberal arts or social science or in any other field. So I guess Rob was talking about earlier how you want to sort of how do you call it, develop a project to propose for the leave. Then actually I never really thought about it. So so I have these long-term research plans, and then when the opportune time comes, so then I really need to take some time off and just I apply for it. So I guess that was my thing. So in my case, so I'm a planetary geophysicist. So my specialty is to develop instrumentation to be flown to the moon and any other planetary bodies, and then so I work with NASA most primarily for the last about 10 years or so. So these instrument development project, so it's usually sort of a multi-institutional project, and that could also involve some aerospace companies and so forth. So that's why. So the time, both times when I applied for the leave, so I really needed to take some time off. Then I could not control the schedule myself because, for example, I wanted to do some experiments in this aerospace company in California. Then they cannot just wait for me to, take time off in the summer to do it because they have to. Their labs are always, has multiple clients, and so that's why I have to take the lab when it's available to do my experiment. So that's why. So the first time when I got the leave, so I had just funded from NASA to do this 3-year project to do some initial development of an instrument to be flown to the moon. So then again, so I needed to do a lot of experimentation. So as soon as I got the proposal funded, then I applied for the leave. Then I was fortunate enough to get the leave granted. So that made it really my sort of management of my project very relatively easy. Then the last time when I applied for the leave, so I was just selected to join on NASA's mission to go to Mars. So then again, that's a big project. So then again, it's just I'm just one of like 100 scientists and engineers who actually participated in planning of the experiments on Mars and designing experiments and so forth. So that's why I didn't have full control of the calendar myself. So I had to go to this NASA's research center in Pasadena, California, on a short notice and that kind of stuff. So those were the reasons I applied for the leave. Then I was able to take advantage of both of these leaves very well, I think. Then so that's why. So my sort of if I were to give some advice to the people who are thinking about planning a leave, so my advice is to, I guess, just don't apply just because you're eligible. I think you kind of want to wait for the most opportune time. Then you have to look at the, what you want to do in the next several years down the road, because once you take the leave, you won't be able to take it again for another 7 years, right? So those came into consideration. Then I just took the time that I thought was the most opportune time to do it. Then I think my proposal was fortunately compelling enough. I guess that it may have helped that I already had a project funded from NASA to do all the experiments I was hoping to do. So that's why kind of sort of whenever when all the stars are sort of fall into places for me, aligned in the right place for me, then I applied. So that was my sort of experience, I guess. Thank you. I don't know if you have any question or anything on that.
Thank you. Let me highlight a couple points. First of all, you heard it from a planetary geoscientist that you wait for your stars to align and before you take the opportunity to apply for a leave. That was great. But there is an important point there. A lot of people I talk to apply just because it's time. Just because there's an opportunity. And I think Seiichi's making a very good point, is that that may not be the most opportune time. And that's going to come out in how your project or your plan is described. And you hear his has some pretty compelling components to it. He acts kind of modest when he says he's just one of 100 scientists and engineers, but there are a lot more than 100 scientists and engineers. And just this handful of them are working on projects with NASA and Mars. That sort of thing stands out. Not everybody's going to be doing that sort of thing, of course, obviously. But what is it about your interest in your projects that you can make appear to be singularly interesting and important, at least among colleagues here at Texas Tech, and what you would bring back to students and colleagues and that kind of work? I think that sort of thing stands out there as well. Anything else for Seiichi before we move on to Wyatt?
Yeah, I think I'm okay. So I'd like to hear what other people's experiences are.
Thank you. All right, Wyatt.
Try that. Okay. So the first thing I would say, again, my experience is all from the side of the committee. So there's no experience like Seiichi in the application process, but certainly I've applied for other grants. And typically when you apply for other grants in your field, even if it's one of the large grants, NEH or NEA or NSF, you're expecting the readers are in your field. So there's and for this, you've got a room that's full equally of people in the humanities and people in the sciences. So you need to be cognizant of the fact that the language that you're using to express your ideas and pitch your project is discernible, decipherable by people not only in your field broadly considered, and again, even like the sciences or engineering, but to someone who works in the social sciences or in the English department or whatever. And that applies again to the other side as well. So if you're in the humanities, you need to be thinking about how you can convincingly make the argument to someone who doesn't know much about the different discussions and arguments and aspects of the types of research that are common to people who work in your own field. I'd add one of the things to keep in mind too is that just like any application for a grant for fellowships, there are certain categories that we're looking to address in terms of how convincing the argument is. And one of those is simply why do you need this in a semester or in a full year? Why can't you do the work over the summer? And Seiichi, I think, made a good point there in terms of the scheduling, right? The scheduling wasn't his own, so he needed the freedom associated with a full semester or a full year. Many people make arguments that they need this time because they need to go to an archive in Boston or even an international space. But I always, unless they address the question of why they need to do that outside of the parameters of the summer, I'm always curious, why isn't the 2.5 months of summer sufficient to do that work? What do you need the full release of faculty duties during the long semester or the long year to do that work? And especially if you're a single scholar, like, Emily's going to speak in just a second, right? If you're just doing your own work on your own time, which most humanities scholars do, then what is it that requires that additional time and release? I would also make sure that you, to the degree that it's possible, address the benefits to the university. And you can think very broadly in these kind of terms. So some of it might be the intangibles. What are the less obvious benefits to, say, student recruitment? How are you going to make contact with people who may want to come, particularly as graduate students? How can this work help foster Texas Tech's larger sort of brand as within the region or within the nation or internationally? And obviously, the bigger you can go, the better, perhaps. But if you can make a strong argument about why this is going to, be important to regional recruitment or to the sort of association just within West Texas or this area of the United States, I think those are equally viable. Just to show that you've thought through it and it's not just an afterthought. I find a lot of them have this sort of as almost an afterthought in terms of what that benefit might be. And the only other thing I'd add is that don't use the negative arguments, right? It's not, I've worked for 17 years without a break and I deserve to have this. The air of I deserve it really sort of turns me off, and it makes me take a step back rather than a step forward. I'm not saying that someone who makes that argument can't ultimately convince me as someone reading that it's still the project and the scholar are still deserving, but rather than making me think, okay, yes, they do, it makes me think, why are they defaulting to this argument? Is that the best argument that they have to convince me that they deserve it? Is because it's been so long since they've had one, or they've worked so hard at, everybody has different levels of administrative duty, and because you've taken on a lot in the past doesn't mean that I'm going to feel inclined to reward you per se with a faculty development leave. Certainly in the last 2 years, the competition for these has been too great to sort of back into being awarded one as a result of that kind of argument. So, and one more thing, if you try and gauge the degree to which you're going to have the support or not of your chair, because that letter is sort of one of the first things that we end up seeing. And if your chair is not going to support you, and there have been a few times where that's been the case, and you have a sense of that, it's maybe something you want to address directly in your application. So those are my sort of contributions, I guess, here.
Thank you, Wyatt. He's really hit on several of the very key elements that are really the point of discussion with the folks I've had talks with about, why they didn't get through on this particular time. And a lot of it just has to do with beyond the substance and the expertise conveyed in the application. It's, why do you need this? This isn't just about doing the project. This is about doing the project and nothing else with respect to Texas Tech for a time. And how do you make that clear as something you don't need, or that you need that additional time to do? I think that's a critical point. And then there's just the point about, as Wyatt said, not just because it's time and I've been here so many years and I deserve this. It's more about the project and and what it redounds back to the unit, the students, your colleagues, in terms of the university as well. And I think there's another important distinction here between Seiichi's and Wyatt's perspectives, and we'll hear more about this from Emily as well, perhaps, from the humanities side of things. But very often the projects in the STEM disciplines are collaborator based. So a big point of the leave is needing to go somewhere to be with these collaborators, like needing to go to a lab in California or needing to go to a site in Europe or something of that sort. Whereas in the humanities, it might be need to go to an archive or need to go to a library. Similar sorts of arguments can be made, but it's less collaborative. They're both proximal kinds of arguments, but that difference in more the solo independent researcher and the collaborative researcher are important for reviewers to be able to distinguish as they look at these as well. Does anyone have anything further for Wyatt before we move on to Jorge? All right. Jorge, your perspective.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so as I said before, I teach over at the law school. I had been started in 2000, so this is my 20th year of teaching, but I applied in 2014. After 14 years, I hadn't taken any faculty development leave, and of course, in theory, you can take it every 5 years. But I had been associate dean for international programs at the law school, so I had been running our international programs. We have 5 semester abroad programs around the world. And at the time, we had 2 summer law programs, and one of our most successful summer law programs was in Mexico. We had run a program there for 25 years, and I had directed that program for 15 years. We are, after violence increased in Mexico, particularly after probably about 2011, 2012, our numbers dropped precipitously in the students that went through. And one of the ways we thought that we would fix that is sort of to update our program and to start teaching more current changes in Mexican law. So somebody had to do the necessary research to sort of restart our program, so to speak. So I had identified 9 different areas where Mexican law had changed almost revolutionary since 2011. And those were, and you may know about these, but there was a comprehensive energy reform law that was signed in 2012. There were Mexican reform laws in the court administration that were quite revolutionary, changing the system from an inquisitorial system into more of a public adversarial system like the United States has. Mexico had opened up their telecommunication and broadcasting system to private investors, which they hadn't done before. They had made new laws regarding foreign ownership of properties in Mexico. Very broad new national climate change laws, labor reform laws, election laws, international treaty law, and how it would be applied to the domestic laws in the United States, and tax law reforms. So my project was basically take these 9 different components and spend my time at my partner school in Mexico, the University of Guanajuato, and basically conduct research on all of these 9 different areas and basically construct 9 modules that were basically that could be either each of these individual modules on each of these different areas could either be used as a separate course to teach on all of these revolutionary new laws that Mexico had passed, or they could be combined into a larger course on just Mexican legal reform, And thirdly, I was also trying to create a module that might be used, let's say, by our petroleum engineers if they wanted to teach something, which Mexico, of course, is one of our largest trading partners, and not only in oil and gas, but it was a kind of module that could be used across the university or in our political science department if they wanted to talk about election laws, or perhaps in a business school if they wanted to talk about the changes in tax reforms. So my idea was to go to Mexico and conduct that research, and really the only place to do the research was to get the original materials in Spanish and do the research at a really good library, and talk to professors who were teaching it, as well as politicians and practitioners in Mexico. So I took a whole year, made my base of operations at the University of Guanajuato. They gave me an office. I also spent time in Mexico City at the UNAM University, which is the major national university in Mexico. So that was basically my project. From the standpoint of being on the committee, I guess number one, I mean, I know this is silly, but it's like, make your application look professional. Sometimes if it's handwritten, especially if it's scribbled, it just isn't a professional presentation. And so the first impression has to be a good impression. You want it to look professionally done. So we all have computers, I'm assuming. Type it up. Don't send in these handwritten forms. Wyatt hit on this. It's like, you gotta have the support of your chairperson. That chairperson's letter better be very positive. That's one of the first things we see. And if the first thing we're seeing is a lukewarm recommendation from your chairperson, it's really going to impact the rest of our reading of your application. So if your chairperson is lukewarm, you better go have a meeting with that chairperson and try to understand why he or she is not more supportive, and ask them, how can I get you to be more supportive? The next thing I look at are your recommendation letters, right? And the recommendation letter should come from somebody other than a personal friend, right? And it's no problem if it's somebody you've worked with or you've written a paper with, but they should be able in that letter to explain all of your great abilities and why you are unique and different. Lots of these letters I'll read will be something like, Professor Ramirez has been a good friend of mine. We were in graduate school together. I've sort of kept up with him. He's really a nice person. I read one of his articles. That's like really like not useful. That's telling me that you can't even find one scholar. You only need 2 letters, right? So go out there and find scholars that can really speak to your abilities, and specifically how your project's going to advance your area of study, your goals. Let me see what else. I had a couple other notes. I know that I'm at 5 minutes. Let me just see. I think those are basically it. And I think the other thing is, what's the benefit to the university? You've got to tell the committee how this is going to benefit not just you. Of course, that's probably the most important part, but also how does this benefit the greater university? Like, for instance, mine was, I'm going to create these modules that can be used across the university, whether it's in the petroleum sciences or at the business school or the political science. It's going to increase our ability to market our international programs. It's going to make us a stronger international summer program by having this unique ability to teach about these unique areas of law. It's going to get me in touch with politicians and policymakers in Mexico who are going to be people that we can bring in and speak to our classes or speak to our university. So those are my points. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. I think some key insights on one hand, you've got a very substantive project base for a leave idea in what was described, but it's also how it's presented. and the tone, if you will, in a literary sense of how it's presented, and what difference is it going to make for others besides just the leave taker here at the university, and can you get that message across in that? I think that's relevant. And I think too, he's talking about how that has implications for very specific programs. He knew when he was going in that way beyond the law school, what he's going to be looking at is going to be relevant elsewhere on campus. And I think reviewers read that as helpful as well. And of course, you have to go there to learn more about and to access the records that are available, more so than being able to do it from here. So I think that's relevant also. So Emily, you probably have some time to cover your experience and your perspectives, and then I think we have plenty of time to take some Q&A from the participants. So please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm excited to share my somewhat limited experience, seeing that I haven't gone on leave yet, but have gone through the application process. So, and I'll keep this brief. Actually, a lot of the points that I wanted to bring up have already been discussed by my co-panelists. So thank you for that, everyone. The first thing I wanted to talk about is how echoing a point that many others have made before me, is that to wait till you're ready to apply. I myself did not apply the first year that I was eligible for because I knew I wasn't ready to make the best use of my precious leave time. When the first year I was eligible was as I was coming up for tenure. And while I was on the tenure track, I wrote my book. My book came out the same month as I submitted my tenure dossier. During the tenure track, I had 2 children. I had a very heavy service load. So by the time I submitted my tenure dossier, I was exhausted. I couldn't think of, I had ideas for my next project, but it certainly wasn't in a place where I felt confident that I could articulate it in a convincing way. And so what I did instead that year was apply for smaller grants from units on campus. I applied for a fellowship through the Humanities Center and money through the Office of Innovation and Research, their Catalyst grant. And I was lucky enough to get 2 of those grants, which allowed me to do some preliminary research the summer after I got tenure. And so as a result of that research that I was able to do over the summer, coming back that next academic year, that's when I put together my application. And I'm confident that my proposal is much, much stronger, having had that year to my ideas and to have done those preliminary archival trips to the archives I needed to go to. I'm confident that I was able to put together a more convincing and better proposal than I would have been if I had thrown it together, the first time I was eligible for. So yeah, my first, again, echoing what other folks have said, is to wait till you're ready. If you're not ready, don't. I mean, part of the benefit of having tenure is not having the same sort of time pressure on yourself. And so if you're not ready, don't apply. Don't feel pressure to, just because you're coming up, it's time. That your clock depends on your own scholarship and your own life, and all those things that are balanced together. So when I was preparing my application, one of the things that I did was I asked colleagues in my department who had recently applied and gotten leave to ask if I could look at their proposal. Generous in sharing that with me, and that was super helpful. I think whenever I'm applying for something, or whenever I'm writing something for the first time, it's always helpful to see a model. And so it was helpful for me to see other folks from history articulating and making sense of their project, would be read by audience members from across the university. Sometimes historians can be sort of myopic in how they talk about their project and the importance of like a particular decade in human history. So it was helpful to see examples of how to frame your project that will make sense to audience members from across the university. And that was exceedingly helpful. Another thing that was helpful to me was to see examples, or to the end, was to see examples of how folks had made connections between their specific projects and benefits to the university. Because as you know, as historians, sometimes our projects can be sort of seem at first blush anyway, esoteric, and to see examples of how folks had articulated a connection between their specific project and the benefit to the university, even if it's as simple as explaining, you know, like in my case, part of what I'll be doing in the fall is, of course, going to archives, assuming that they're open, assuming the pandemic is over. In addition to going to archives, I'll be applying for long-term fellowship grants. And I talked about that in the proposal, and I was strategic in mentioning how a number of those grants that I'll be applying for are on the list of incentivized grants the university has prioritized in terms of things that they want us to apply for. So I was sure to include that in my proposal as another way of explaining what I'll be doing, and again, making a connection between what I will be doing in my time and benefit to the university. So that sort of runs the list of what I was hoping to talk about, and I'm, of course, eager to hear your questions for the people there at home. I guess we're all at home. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I think a highlight to me from what you said was applying as you're going into the year for tenure, because it's upon receiving tenure and after that faculty are eligible for these leaves. But in your case, you're seeing how what you've been doing to get you where you want to be professionally at the time you go up for tenure is something you can continue in a project that would make you eligible for a leave. And that kind of redounds to what Seiichi was saying earlier about waiting on an opportunity. That opportunity can still be very early in a career, but it's the idea of, it wasn't just sitting back and taking a breath. Well, I got tenure, so I deserve a leave. It's, I see an opportunity where what I've been working on can be expanded and receive some focus if I do this now. And I think that's an important perspective there also. So that's from our panelists. For those of you that are participating, listening to the panel, we'd certainly entertain your questions of any of the individuals, or just throwing questions out there. If you're able to access the chat sub-screen, I don't know how it looks on yours, it's on the left of my screen. When you click that little chat icon down there, you can pose your questions in the chat thing, as Dr. Cummins is now typing something, or you can ask, I guess it's orally, you can ask a question of anyone as well. Again, I would ask that as you ask a question, if it's not in a dialogue, mute yourself again so that we just avoid feedback to the extent possible. But if we have some dialogue going on, that's fine too. We would certainly welcome that. So I'll pause for any questions. Glenn Cummins asks, how many applications are submitted and how many are awarded? I don't think that's a mundane question, because I think, as Wyatt said, it's gotten very competitive in the last couple of years. Up until a couple of years ago, we could anticipate probably 35 to 40 applications. What we've seen the last 2 years is in the range of 60 applications. I think we had 58 one year and 62 the other, whichever it was. And what we are able to award, let's assume they were all one semester leaves, we would be able to award 42. And that's based on the funding model that we have, where for each semester's leave a faculty member takes, that department gets some funds from the provost's office to help cover the teaching that is vacated by that faculty member. Obviously, it doesn't pay a salary, but it might cover the cost of a one-course instructional appointment, something of that sort, maybe overload for somebody that's covering it, what have you. So with that amount of funding, we can do 42 one-semester leaves. Well, each year we have a handful that are for the full year. So if any of those full year leaves are awarded, that reduces that number again by that factor. So usually in the neighborhood of 38 to 40 leaves is what gets awarded. And as was mentioned, out of those last couple of years, that means 12 to 15 applications were not accepted. And you can always, as the committee members will know, the ones that are on that margin somewhere, wherever that cut is made, are probably eligible. It really just comes down to that fine line of, well, we only have so much money, and we have to find distinguishing characteristics that warrant moving ahead with this application. So I always try to encourage people, particularly if they've come and visited about it, try again. I don't tell them exactly where they fall in that range, but try again, and we'll talk through some of the kinds of things that the committee has shared today to help strengthen those applications. So I got a little bit beyond the question on that, Glenn, but did get the numbers in there. Other questions or comments?
This is Donald Lee from Electrical Computer Engineering. I'm not sure whether you can hear me okay.
Yes, Donald.
Yes, great. Okay, so I appreciate that. I've been here for 14 years, and I was contemplating on having a sabbatical leave. There's like a University of Kyoto. They have been inviting me to go there. I'm also a chair professor with one of the university in Taiwan. But right now with the COVID-19 virus, I just don't think I'm willing to travel. Okay, but then with this situation, is it possible to apply for like one semester and then several years down the road, another one semester leave, and we will still, if I can travel, I'll travel. If I cannot, I would just have tele conferences with them, with the students doing the research. So international kind of thing. Yeah.
That's a good question. And I think you're asking a question that we don't yet know based on the season we're living through at the moment. The question is, when do we go back to face-to-face on-site activity? And even though we do it here, are we going to have international travel? Are we going to have, right now I wouldn't recommend anybody taking a leave in New York. We'll even have domestic concerns for a period of time. So I think those are questions we'll probably just have to address as the next few months open up. Now, somewhat relevant to your question is, although not a priori, we do have from time to time a faculty member who's been awarded a leave. Let's say if it was somebody who went through the process this fall and their awarded notification was made in February. Well, come March, April, May, something happens, perhaps on the other end, perhaps a familial issue arises or something, and what they had planned for the upcoming fall or spring isn't going to work out with regard to that disruption, whatever it is. Can they defer? And we've allowed those deferrals from one year to the next under those kind of circumstances. So that's somewhat related, I think, to what you were asking, but not specific to the COVID situation.
But is it possible to have one semester leave and then reapply in a couple of years again?
Well, the policy is after 5 years, you take a leave, and 5 years later you can apply again, and so in the 6th year after your previous leave, you're eligible.
I see. So it makes sense. If I've already been here for more than 14 years, then it makes sense to apply for a whole year.
Well, it just depends on your project, whether you apply for a whole year or a semester.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yep. Sorry to take up the time. Okay.
Oh, no. Those are good questions. And one distinction to make, since you asked about 1 year versus one semester, with regard to Texas Tech HR employment considerations. A full year leave, you only get half of your Texas Tech pay. And so usually faculty members who are taking that full year leave have an engagement with another institution or entity that is going to make up the difference for them on that half a year's pay. And that's why, out of 42 applications, we're probably going to see 38 to 40 that are for a semester only, because you retain that full pay and you're not dependent on another entity to cover that.
Hey, Rob, can I say something to build
Yes.
on the answer? So when you apply in the application document, there is a question before you even go into your own narrative that asks, have you received one of Texas Tech's faculty development leaves before in the past? If so, what was the result of that leave? So, Donald, to your question, you could make the argument, in that 6th year, say that I did, but because of travel elements, at the time that I was awarded the faculty development leave, I wasn't able to, travel, and that's why I'm applying now in the 6th year rather than, because most people will wait more than 5. There is some discussion sometimes that if someone has had one, in that, if they're applying immediately upon becoming eligible for a second time, then maybe there's a question of trying to spread the wealth, so to speak. But I think if you have a strong justification for why maybe the components of your research didn't fully, flower in the way that you had originally hoped, that you can make that argument to the committee fairly straightforwardly. And even in that, you're sort of priming that argument by saying when you had your last leave and what was the sort of deliverable or the result there.
I think that's an excellent point, that that perception of rushing it and taking it just for taking its sake comes across sometimes in that kind of timeline. Other comments or questions? Just as Wyatt did, do any of the panelists have other thoughts that have come to mind that hadn't been addressed yet?
I'll just add that in response to Donald's question, that I did take a 1-year leave of absence, and that is can be hard if you're taking half of your salary, but I found it well worthwhile, and you do have to justify the time. I mean, it can't just be, in my case, is like, well, I hadn't taken the leave for 14 years, so I deserve a year off. I really did have a project that could consume, in fact, has consumed greater than 1 year. So it was quite valuable for me. So again, whether to take a 1 semester or 2 semester really depends upon how much work you're going to be doing.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Sage. Can I add to that sort of discussion about 1 semester versus 1 year?
Yes.
The other point of view is that, so what's going to happen to the course you're not teaching while you're taking the leave? And so in my case, so I thought about, taking two long semesters or 1 semester. Then my department just said, well, if I take a year off, nobody can teach this course while I'm gone. So that kind of one of the factors, deciding on just 1 semester instead of one full year.
That's a good point. And on that point, I'd like to say a little something about the role of chairs. And you've heard that mentioned a couple of times. I think we would anticipate and hope that a faculty member planning a leave application is in conversation with your department chair or your school director about that for reasons just alluded to. There's course coverage kinds of issues. Not that the chair should talk you out of it, but should talk you into thinking about the implications of that leave. Is this the best time? Maybe sometime later would be better. You can have that conversation with them as well. But we also have some accountability we expect of the chairs in trying to have some parity in what they send forward. Sometimes we have some departments that will send forward 4 or 5 applicants, 2 or 3 of whom are applying for the same semester. And I would encourage that a chair and the dean after them on those applications provide some sort of prioritization or ranking of those applications from their perspective. Don't leave it up to this committee to decide, if 3 in a particular semester is too many for your department. They're not going to be looking at it that way. They're going to be looking at it in terms of the substance and presentation of the application. And the assumption is the chair is okay with this if the chair gave it approval and they've got their teaching covered and so forth. All that to say, you really need to have conversations with your departmental or unit leadership about what your plans are so that they have some time to think through and discuss with you their plans as well. Anything further from anyone? I would just really want to encourage you, if you were here listening to the panelists, to think about applying for a leave or applying again if you've done so recently. I hope some of what has been said would be useful to you. One thing that struck me after hearing these folks talk about their perspectives and experiences is, particularly those that have served on committee, you get a sense of how seriously they take those reviews. To be able to come out here this afternoon and articulate what they look for and how these certain elements are important, they're reading them, and they're reading them very carefully, and they're making some judgments about how those come across. So this is a very serious process, and one that is by nature, I think, competitive. But we have committee members who do an excellent job of making sure it works out. Well, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. It's good to be connected with folks we might not otherwise be connected with during this time. So I hope everyone is doing well and stays safe. Thank you, TLPDC, as always, for helping us organize and get this thing together.
Absolutely.
If any of you individually have questions or comments, you're welcome to contact any of the panelists or me directly, and we'll be happy to further discuss this with you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Do take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
Bye.